Hello, friends. You won't believe how a billionaire's grandson terrorized an entire school. Until a 72-year-old librarian stood in his way. Stay with us till the very end. Because in the finale you'll see what unexpected gift this boy gave her. We're so glad you're here. Tell us in the comments from which city are you watching us? And how old are you? Morning light poured through the tall windows of the city's most immaculate private school, laying neat rectangles across polished floors and rows of pristine desks. Order lived here, bells that chimed on time, shoes that didn't squeak, voices tuned to the quiet key of money. But order can be broken by a single child. Alexander Carter, 11 years old, light-skinned, small for his age, but burning like a fuse, hit the room like weather. His face was flushed, the tendons in his neck taut with a fury he couldn't name. He shoved a chair so hard it skittered, legs shrieking against the tile, books toppled. A globe spun once and dropped with a thud that made the class flinch. "Don't tell me what to do," he shouted, voice cracking on the last word. The teacher froze, one hand lifted, the other clutching a dry erase marker as if it were a lifeline. Around her, children scrambled, some ducked, some clasped hands over ears. Some stared with the helpless fascination you give to lightning. He grabbed a stack of workbooks and flung them to the floor. Paper flew like startled birds. A poster peeled from the wall, courage, in big friendly letters, and he tore it into without reading it. It wasn't courage he lacked. It was somewhere to put the storm dot in the corridor. Footsteps gathered, and then hesitated. Adults spoke in the low, fragile voices people use when they're afraid to be wrong. Somewhere, a phone was already dialing someone important. The doors down, the library breathed in quiet. Ms. Esther Black, 72, silver curls tucked under a patterned headscarf, brown cardigan softened by years of use, was rolling a cart between stacks, humming a tune she'd hummed since the children she once read to were now reading to their own. She heard the crash, the shout, the hush before the next shout. She didn't startle. She set one book on the cart with the same careful respect she gave all books. And she listened the way you listen for rain on a roof, to know which room will leak first. Back in the classroom, the principal appeared in the doorway, and with her, the smell of polished wood and policy. "Alexander," she began. And that was all just his name, but even that seemed to unspool something inside him. And he reached for the nearest thing, another chair, another noise. He wasn't big enough to be frightening, and yet he was. It wasn't his size. It was the feeling that nothing inside him had a place to sit down. You looked like a boy who wanted to leave his body the way you leave a burning building. A shadow fell across the hall glass, a man arriving faster than a secretary could finish a sentence. Tailored charcoal suit, white hair combed with purpose, shoulders that still knew how to square themselves even after 7 decades. Edmund Carter, the grandfather, not a parent, but a patriarch. Not a guardian by warmth, but by estate planning. His light eyes were the color steel gets when you wipe it clean. You could see the city in his cufflinks. He did not come into the room at first. He watched. He had learned long ago that power is a door you can open by doing nothing at all. The teacher lowered her gaze. The principal adjusted her tone, too. Staff members took a step back they would later deny. Alexander saw the shadow, then the man, then the way everyone else saw the man. Something in his face hardened in return. A mirror held up to us. He kicked the toppled globe and dared anyone to call it a mistake. Down the hall, Ms. Esther left her cart mid-aisle. The rubber wheels muttered to a stop. She took off her cardigan, just the weight of it, and laid it across the counter as if she might need both hands for whatever came next. When she reached the classroom, a security guard lifted a palm as if to shield her from the scene, or the scene from her. She gave him a look that was gentler than no and firmer than yes, and she stepped inside. What struck her wasn't the noise. It was the boy's face, rage braided to fear, breath hitching in the shallow way a body learns when it never expects the next minute to be safe. She didn't see a menace. She saw a child whose story no one had stayed long enough to read. "Child," she said, voice low enough to ask, strong enough to hold. "I hear you." He swung his glare toward her, ready to split the world again. But her calm wasn't a wall. It was a place to sit down. She took one small step closer and another. The way you approach a skittish animal or a wounded truth. Behind the glass, Edmund Carter's jaw turned to granite. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His presence said everything money says before words do. "Fix this." Alexander's hands shook. The room waited for the next crash. Miss Esther folded her own hands at her waist, palms open. "Storms pass," she told him. "They always do. Let this one pass with you still here." For a heartbeat one. Then the boy didn't move. The class didn't breathe. The principal's pen hovered useless in the air. Then the bell rang. Nowhere and everywhere in the building. A jolt that made everyone flinch at once. As if relief were an alarm you couldn't silence. The moment broke. The storm did not, but it knew now that someone had looked it in the eye and refused to run, or to return the way order always does on paper first. That the library had heard the weather, and the man in the glass had taken its measure, and the old woman with the gentle voice had decided, without asking anyone's permission, that this story wouldn't end in a file. The echo of the morning lived in the hallways all day like a rumor that wouldn't die. Faculty spoke. In careful clauses, children made their laughter smaller, as if big happiness could trigger big trouble. Before lunch, the school had done what schools do when fear wants proof. It wrote a letter. Due to repeated disruptions and credible concerns for the safety of students and staff, Alexander Carter is suspended indefinitely pending further evaluation. Indefinitely is a word adults use when they want to sound less cruel than forever, and more decisive than we don't know what to do. The principal read the letter aloud to a room that smelled like coffee and caution. The counselor nodded in the key of liability. A board liaison watched the clock and the doorway. No one asked Alexander a question because no one wanted an answer they couldn't place into a form. By mid-afternoon, Edmund Carter was in the principal's office, not sitting, but occupying. A tall white man around 70 in a suit the color of certain skies before a storm. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to, because silence belongs to men like him. Other people make it for them. How long, he asked, as if time were a service he purchased. Indefinitely, the principal repeated, Saturnalis. Though the word had acquired a cost, he glanced once at his grandson light-skinned face held tight. Eyes rimmed red not from crying, but from holding tears under pressure until they turned to heat. Alexander stared at the floor like it owed him money. I will arrange alternatives, Edmund said. The way you say I will buy a new building. Mr. Carter, the counselor tried gently. This isn't only about academics. He needs. What? He needs, Edmund replied, is to stop terrifying rooms. He turned to the principal. We will require a supervised quiet space while I secure evaluators. He will not be at home idle. He will not be in classrooms. Choose somewhere he cannot break things someone else needs. The principal opened her palms in the direction of the library, as if the library were not a place but a solution. Miss Esther, he repeated, testing the shape of the name as if it were a price. The librarian, she knows our students, the principal offered. She knows everyone. Edmund checked his watch, which was nothing like anyone else's watch. Temporary. Supervised. No photographs. No visitors. No press. The arrangements were made the way. Arrangements always are for people who never hear the word no. A note was added to a file. Signatures proliferated, and the school exhaled as if the problem had been placed in a box and slid under a bed. That evening, the Carter residence rose out of its hedges like a geometry problem. Marble echoed in the foyer. Photos along a hallway documented philanthropy, not family. Alexander's mother and father existed in the world, but not in this home. They were continents and custody agreements, holidays and headlines. The boy ate in a room with too much width for one child. Edmund took his meal in the study and called 3 consultants who knew how to invoice shock. He did not sleep. Men like him do not sleep when anything threatens to be bigger than their will. He stared through 12 floors of glass at a city he could move with a paragraph and considered the insult of being unable to move a boy. The next morning, Alexander was delivered to the library on time, as if grief were a class in rage. A subject was standardized test. He slouched at a back table, light-skinned face set to I dare you, hands coiled in his sleeves. He looked everywhere, but at the shelves, as those stories might jump down and shame him for needing them. Miss Esther Black, 72. The soft click of her shoes louder than most people's declarations did not ask him why he was angry, or how he felt, or whether he would promise to be good. She brought an empty chair to the table. She set it just to his left at a respectful distance. Chairs are invitations you don't say out loud. Edmund stood at the threshold for a long count, making a study of the room, exit routes, line of sight, witnesses, risk. When his eyes passed over Miss Esther, he saw a woman. When hers passed over him, she saw a boy's grandfather. Temporary, he reminded the space, which nodded without moving. Then he left, because men who live at altitude never stay where gravity might introduce them to themselves. Indefinitely had begun. Exile had a desk, and in a city where everything expensive pretends to be permanent, the quiet woman behind the counter and the small boy behind his anger were about to do the most radical thing money cannot rush. Take their time. The library kept a different clock. Seconds got larger in there. Words slowed them down and then made them forget they'd ever been small. On the 3rd afternoon of exile, the light came in long and honey-colored Just move the way the mind does when it stops apologizing for wandering. Alexander sat with his shoulders turned toward the aisle, the universal posture of a creature that wants to flee without admitting it might also want to stay. Miss Esther pushed a small cart, each book stacked as if it deserved a bed. She hummed a tune that had crossed oceans in her grandmother's throat. When she reached his table, she did not speak. She placed a single book on the wood, not in front of him, never a command, but near enough to be chosen. Its spine was cracked the way good spines are, by faithful bending. He stared at it as one stares at a closed door when you are not sure if the house behind it is for you. Minutes rehearsed being minutes. In a corner, a clock ticked politely. Outside, a siren went by and was gone. He looked down at his hands, up at the ceiling, down at his hands again. Then, with the care of someone touching a creature that might bite, he opened the cover. An illustration waited on the first page, a small light-skinned boy, not unlike himself, facing a beast that was mostly shadow and teeth. The boy held a candle that looked almost embarrassed by how little it was. The text beside it did something sentences sometimes do when they belong to a voice you didn't know you could welcome. It told the truth, without judging you for it. This is the boy everyone feared. They called him names the way some people call you to dinner. They mistook his noise for hate and his breaking for wanting to break things. No one asked him what the beast's name was. No one offered him a smaller word for it. Alexander felt something in his chest that wasn't rage. It was the thing under rage. The ache heavy as sleep after a long day of running from nothing you can point to. He turned the page, then another, then didn't notice he was turning pages at all. Miss Esther watched from 3 stacks away, the way a person watches a skittish bird drink. Not with joy yet. With reverence you don't scare. She did not smile. Smiles can be alarms if you haven't heard them in a while. She let the room do the holding. By the time the door opened, the sun had moved. Edmund Carter's figure filled the threshold again. All white hair and polished shoes, and the impatience of a man who deeds islands for charity. He expected sulk, destruction, proof of his thesis. What he saw, his grandson bent over a book, lips moving silently, shoulders released by centimeters you would miss if you'd never had to measure. Relief did not fit. Alexander looked up, startled, as if caught stealing. He slammed the cover shut so fast the air puffed. His face returned to the mask he needed for people who count their feelings in debits and credits. Blank enough to pass through metal detectors, Edmund's gaze slid to Miss Esther. She neither apologized nor performed pride. She simply stood, with the dignity of a black woman who has held generations together with patience no institution will ever pay fairly for. And she inclined her head as if saying to him, and not to him, "Here is a way, tomorrow." Edmund said to the room, to the boy, to his fear, same time. He left before anyone could think he'd softened. Alexander touched the book's cloth again when the door stilled. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. There are some pages you keep reading after you've closed them, that night, somewhere high above most people's city. Edmund poured a drink and pretended not to look at his own reflection in the window. He saw, for half a second, not the man. The papers photographed, but a grandfather who had never learned the grammar of comfort. He set the glass down, untasted. In the morning, the library unlocked on schedule. The cart squeaked. The chair waited. And Miss Esther placed the same book in the same spot. Which is how you tell a frightened creature this world might repeat the good things. When men like Edmund Carter change their minds, they do it like they sign contracts privately with witnesses. Reluctantly, in pen, he had not changed his mind. He had only encountered a fact that didn't fit and decided to interrogate the person who made it. He arrived early, which is how powerful people say, "I will control the terms of this conversation." The library was still drawing its first breath of the day. Miss Esther was straightening a display no one but children bothered to admire. She wasn't surprised to see him. "You don't live to 72 without learning to recognize weather." "Miss Esther," he began, letting the honorific work off some of his impatience. "I understand my grandson has been cooperative here. He's been a boy here," she said. "That's better. Let us be clear," he continued, white hair immaculate, voice smooth as a legal brief. "I am not here to indulge romantic notions about literature. I have hired experts. I have funded institutes. I am prepared to do so again. What I am not prepared to do is outsource my air's volatility to fairy tales." Miss Esther removed her glasses and cleaned them with the hem of her headscarf. It was an old, quiet gesture that made him wait. "Mr. Carter," she said at last, "I don't run fairy tales. I run a room where a child can set down what is too heavy. Stories are tools. Some people use scalpels. I use sentences. He needs both the knife that cuts out the lie and the words that tell him he didn't deserve it in the first place." He looked at the rows of spines as if they might assemble an argument for him. What precisely do you propose? That you let me do what I know, she answered, and that you stop doing what hasn't worked. He almost laughed. It would have sounded like ice-breaking. Terms, he said, meaning go on. Time, she said first. Not as a threat, as a gift. No deadlines pinned to his behavior. Like badges or shame, measurable outcomes are how children are not divisions. She cut in softly. They are chapters. You read them through, or you don't get the ending. He pressed his lips together. Freedom, she prompted. Herself, before he could argue the first down to dust. Freedom to choose material. To start in the middle if that's where the child is. Freedom to let silence work. Freedom from cameras. Freedom from your presence while I gain his trust. His chin lifted a quarter inch. My presence is not a liability. It is to a boy who only ever sees you when something breaks, she replied, not unkindly. Let him see you at the end of the story you didn't control. It will teach him more about love than any lecture on discipline ever did. He studied her long enough to catalog the details. The silver at her temples, the softness at her mouth, the way she squared her shoulders with neither apology nor aggression. She was black and small and older than the building. She had no titles he respected and a competence he could not purchase. What else, he asked. Because he always asked until the other person's list ran out. A promise, she said. That when he laughs and he will you won't rush. And to own it as proof of your provision. And when he fails and he will you won't rush in to punish the failure for embarrassing your name. He needs a grandfather, not a board. Silence sat down between them. He looked past her at the table, where the boy usually chose the end seat, back to the wall. He tried to remember if anyone had ever spoken to him like this without losing something for it. He tried and could not doubt at last. He nodded once. The way a bridge nods when it decides not to collapse. You shall have your time, he said, picking the word up with 2 fingers. And your freedom. Within reason, the caveat was reflex, a muscle developed by decades of never conceding everything. Ms. Esther replaced her glasses. Within compassion, she countered. Which was not a clause he could negotiate, but a map he could follow if he chose. He turned to go. Then paused with one hand on the frame and asked a question. That surprised both of them. What should I do, he said, in the I carried years while you are reading. Find a story you were denied, she said. Read it badly. Read it anyway. Then tell him, when he is ready, what it felt like to begin late and not be ashamed. He left without answering. Men like Edmund prefer their generosity anonymous and their revelations private. But that evening, somewhere inside a house full of art he never had time to love, he opened a book. He read aloud, alone. In a room no one had ever laughed in. His voice stumbled and then found a rhythm that did not belong to meetings. And the next day, at the same small table, Ms. Esther set the same crack-spine book where a light-skinned boy could choose it again. And the storm inside him looked around, saw no one ready to punish it for existing, and considered the strange possibility that it could rain without drowning anything. Alexander sat stiffly in the chair at the far end of the library, arms folded across his small chest as though he were wearing armor. His expensive blazer was wrinkled, his blonde hair tousled from an earlier tantrum. His blue-gray eyes darted from shelf to shelf like a trapped animal searching for a way out. He had been forced into this session by his grandfather, Edmund Carter, who now stood by the door like a guard, arms crossed, his custom suit immaculate, but his face carved in cold disapproval. Miss Esther, however, sat at a low one in table S. Though nothing was unusual, her dark skin glowed under the soft amber lamps, her silver-streaked hair pulled back into a loose bun, and her reading glasses hung low on her nose. She held an old copy of The Secret Garden in her hands, its pages worn soft by decades of children before him. Her voice was warm, steady, patient. At first, Alexander refused to even look at her. He kicked the leg of his chair, muttered curses under his breath, ugly words learned far too young. Edmund's jaw tightened. You see, he hissed under his breath. He doesn't want this. But Esther didn't even flinch. She turned a page, her voice weaving through the silence, low and melodic, as if she were singing rather than reading. The rhythm of her words filled the room, wrapping it in an invisible blanket. Slowly, imperceptibly, Alexander's restless foot stopped tapping. His eyes flicked toward her just for a second. She didn't call him out. She didn't seize the moment triumphantly. She simply kept reading. And then something shifted. The story mentioned a boy who had lost his mother. Alexander's eyes froze. His lip trembled. Esther's voice softened, like a hand reaching into his chest and holding his heart. She didn't add commentary, didn't push, didn't ask, do you feel that too? She'd just read. Why? Why is he hiding in the garden? Alexander whispered suddenly, almost without realizing the words had left his mouth. Edmund blinked. Stunned, his grandson had spoken, asked a question. Miss Esther looked up slowly, eyes glistening. She smiled gently. Because sometimes when we hurt, we build walls. But gardens don't care about walls. They grow through them. For the first time, Alexander didn't scowl at the answer. He leaned forward, his small fist unclenching. When Esther gave a soft chuckle at a playful line in the book, he glanced up and then, awkwardly, he laughed too. It was a rusty sound, unused for years, but real. Edmund Carter's throat tightened. He looked away, hiding the wetness in his eyes. For all the billions he commanded, for all the empires he owned, he had never been able to reach his grandson like this. But this black librarian, with no degrees in psychology, with no power in the world except her voice and her patience, had cracked open the boy's armor in less than an hour. And in that fragile moment, everything began to change. Media attacks. Esther, accusing her of being an unqualified librarian raising the billionaire's grandson. Family's board of directors demands she be removed. The first article hit the morning papers like a thunderclap, a glossy headline stretched across the page in bold, merciless letters, billionaire's grandson in the hands of a librarian, with no credentials. Alexander's photograph, taken without permission, was plastered beneath the words. He looked furious, his small fist clenched, his pale face red mid-scream. And beside him, Miss Esther. Her warm brown skin, her grandmotherly frame, her calm gaze caught mid-blink was painted as something almost scandalous. The article dripped with mockery. The Carters, one of the wealthiest families in the nation, entrust their troubled heir not to doctors, not to private academies, but to a 72-year-old librarian with no medical training. When Edmund Carter read it at breakfast, his knuckles whitened around the porcelain cup of coffee. He sat at the head of his impossibly long dining table, dressed in a flawless gray suit, a diamond watch glinting in the morning light. His board of advisors was already assembled, their voices sharp, buzzing like hornets. This is reputational suicide, snapped one of them, a younger man in a navy suit. Edmund, you cannot allow this woman to continue. The shareholders are already questioning your judgment. A librarian, without certification, the press will bury us. Another board member, an older woman with steel hair, leaned forward. You have an empire to protect. Your grandson is a child. Yes, but your name is eternal. You cannot gamble it on her. She practically spat the word. Edmund's jaw flexed. His pale blue eyes flickered with turmoil. He glanced sideways. Alexander sat at the far corner of the table, tiny compared to the oak chairs, wearing a wrinkled shirt and sneakers he had scuffed until the leather peeled. The boy's eyes were swollen from crying because he had seen the article too. I'm a freak, Alexander whispered, voice breaking. The entire room froze. His voice was so small, but it carried like thunder. He pushed the newspaper across the table with trembling hands, showing them his own red face in the photograph. That's what they think. That's what everyone thinks. And if you take her away, he looked at his grandfather, tears spilling over now. If you take Miss Esther away, then I'll really be nothing. For a moment, the billionaire's fortress heart cracked. He saw not the angry boy who broke things, not the heir to his empire, but a child drowning in loneliness. His own grandson. The doors opened. Miss Esther walked in, uninvited, her steps slow but steady. She wore her modest cardigan, her silver hair tied back. Her dark skin shone in the light of the chandeliers, her presence somehow towering despite her small frame. She looked directly at Edmund. Not the board. I didn't come here to fight with newspapers, she said, her voice low but steady. I came here because a boy needed someone to stay, and I stayed. One advisor scoffed, with respect. Madam, you have no qualifications. Her eyes snapped toward him, and for a heartbeat the entire room felt the weight of her gaze. I have the only qualification that matters. He laughs when I read to him. He asks questions. He sleeps through the night. Your degrees do that. Silence. Edmund Carter felt every eye on him. His empire, his reputation, his pride all balanced on this choice. And then he looked at Alexander, trembling, desperate, staring at him as though the man's decision would decide whether his fragile hope lived or died. And in that moment, Edmund Carter realized the board was wrong. The press was wrong. This woman, the 72-year-old librarian, was the first person to reach his grandson's heart. He drew a long breath. His voice was cold, commanding, final. She stays. The board erupted in protest. Headlines would get uglier. Stocks might dip. His empire could take a blow. But Edmund Carter, billionaire, tycoon, man who had spent a lifetime building walls of steel, had chosen a different kind of strength. He chose his grandson, and Miss Esther's dark eyes softened. For the first time, she saw the beginnings of a man willing to fight not just for power, but for love. The auditorium had the hush of a courtroom and the glare of a stage. Folding chairs lined up like judgments, microphones wired like tripwires, cameras blinking their red eyes. Parents filled the aisles with whispers. Reporters stood on tiptoe. A cluster of trustees sat in the front row in charcoal suits that swallowed light. At the back, a boy in a too large blazer tried to make himself smaller than his fear. Alexander Carter, light-skinned, 11. Small hands clenched in the sleeves of his jacket kept his eyes down. He could feel the whisper of his name traveling the room before it reached him. The grandson. The outburst. The problem. He instinctively tightened his jaw the way some people put on armor. Beside the aisle, Edmund Carter stood, tall and pale, as a marble column, white hair immaculate, blue eyes hard as cut glass. The billionaire patriarch did not fidget. He did not blink under the floodlights for 70 years. He had been the room people entered carefully. Now he stood in a room that might not bow. And then Miss Esther walked to the podium. She was small and sure, a black woman of 72 with silver spiraled beneath a patterned headscarf, deep brown skin that caught the stage lights, and a cardigan that had weathered more winters than the trustees' reputations. She adjusted the microphone with steady hands. The feedback squeak snapped every head toward her. The chair of the board leaned in, voice smooth as an apology that admits nothing. Miss Esther, for the record, you are not licensed as a therapist. Correct. You have been meeting with Mr. Carter's grandson in the school library, uncredentialed, unsupervised. She didn't flinch. For the record, she said, her voice the warm low of a cello. I am a children's librarian. I have been reading to other people's children longer than most of you have been writing checks. A ripple. A camera shudder. A cough swallowed. She looked, not at the trustees, but at the parents, then at the boy in the back. You have asked me to explain what I am doing. I will tell you. She let the room breathe once. I am staying. A murmur. Someone laughed, sharply, and regretted it. Her gaze never wavered. When a child is loud, people call security. When a child is quiet, people call it progress. Neither is listening. This boy, she lifted a hand toward the aisle without pointing it like a spear, has been carrying an anger too heavy for his size. You called it defiance. I called it grief. You called it danger. I called it please don't leave me alone. With this, she swallowed, steadying, and then gave them the sentence that would be quoted. Misquoted, tattooed on posters and pinned to refrigerators. He's not a monster. He's a child who needs stories, not punishment. Silence fell like snow. Stories make a room inside you for the feelings that won't fit anywhere else. She continued. They hand you words when your own have run away. They give you someone to be for a while who is not the worst thing anyone ever said about you. I read to him. He listens. He laughs. He sleeps. He has not broken a chair in 3 weeks. I don't need a license to tell you that matters. A trustee leaned toward the mic to interrupt. Edmund's stare pinned him to his seat without a word. The cameras swung to the billionaire. He did not blink. A reporter called out, Miss Esther, are you saying professionals failed this boy? She shook her head. I am saying the boy failed to meet the timetable of people who stopped staying when it got hard. Professionals are not the enemy. Hurry is. Someone sniffed. Someone else wiped their eyes. Parents shifted in their seats, as if trying to find a more honest posture. Miss Esther rested both hands on the lectern. You can close my room, she said, gentle as weather, but you cannot stop me from reading. If you take away these 4 walls, I will read on the steps. If you rope off the steps, I will read under a tree. If you cut down the tree, I will read in a whisper that finds him anyway. Because this is not a program, this is witness. A soft sound rose from the back paper rustling. Alexander, face pale and determined, stood. His voice, when it came, was small but clear enough to cross the aisle. She makes it quiet in my head, he said. That's all. The room drew breath as one. Edmund Carter stepped forward at last. Cameras clicked like hail. He reached the second microphone and stood with the patience of a man who had learned to weaponize silence and then chose not to. My name is Edmund Carter, he said, as if anyone needed telling. I have built things measured in miles and zeros. I have ruined men who deserved it and spared men who did not. I have never been braver than this woman. He turned to Miss Esther, inclined of the head, respect, not ownership. Back to the room, she stays. Protest erupted, policy, precedent, liability, and then faltered against the fact of the boy. Standing straighter now, as if the words had handed him a spine he didn't have to harden into. Miss Esther stepped from the microphone. As she passed Alexander, she let her fingers brush the back of his hand, a permission, not a rescue. He didn't pull away. Edmund watched, blue eyes unguarded for the first time in public memory. and the press drained to smell blood caught instead the scent of surrender that wasn't defeat. A kind of strength money rarely buys, humility. The hearing adjourned into noise, but the story had already rearranged itself. It began with a name that wasn't a brand. Miss Esther wrote it on a slip of index card with a library pencil. The graphite soft, the listening room. No logos, no marble plaques, just a promise disguised as a place. Edmund Carter could have bought a building uptown without seeing it. Instead, he asked Miss Esther where a child would feel safe entering. She pointed to a decommissioned community hall 3 blocks from the school, red brick, windows that blinked tiredly, a small courtyard that remembered how to hold laughter. He bought the deed by lunchtime and arrived that afternoon without a tie, sleeves rolled to his forearms. A white man in his 70s who looked briefly like someone who might have been a boy once. They scrubbed, they painted, they argued about chairs. Edmund wanted rows. Miss Esther wanted circles. She won. Then placed one extra chair slightly apart for the child who wasn't ready to join yet. She curated shelves not by reading level, but by ache, anger, loss, fear, shame, hope, healing. Each spine was a hand extended. Alexander helped. The light-skinned boy who had once measured rooms by how to break them, now measured them by how sound carried, where a laugh could bounce and multiply, where a whisper could be heard without being chased. He tagged the lower shelves with crooked labels and pencil dragons, secret doors. Kids who run away but come back, and beamed when Miss Esther left the spelling mistakes in place on purpose. Stories aren't spelling tests, she told him. They're maps. On opening day, there was no ribbon, only a door already ajar. Children arrived with their parents' apology clinging to their coats, a girl who counted her breaths instead of reading, a boy with fists that remembered too much, a pair of siblings who spoke only to each other. Reporters hovered outside until Edmund stepped into the doorway and said, "No cameras." They lowered their lenses because something in his voice hinted at an older story than the news could tell. Miss Esther gathered the children in a circle on a rug patterned with constellations. She did not start with rules. She started with a question. "What do you wish a grown-up would say to you?" They stared, surprised by the shape of the invitation. The girl who counted said, very softly, "Stay." A boy added, "Don't be mad at me for being sad." Another, "Please don't tell me to calm down before you tell me how." She nodded as if they had handed her rare books. Then she opened one of her own. Her voice did what it always did, tune the air to listening. When the funny part landed, Alexander laughed first and loudest. The laughter spread, awkward and bright. Edmund felt it hit his chest like weather turning, and he reached for the back of a chair to steady himself, surprised by the idea that joy had weight over the next weeks. The listening room learned its rhythms. Mornings for reading aloud, afternoons for quiet corners where a child could sit with a book and not be asked to perform understanding. In the back, a writing table with blunt pencils and unlined paper. Miss Esther's rule: write anything, cross nothing out. On Wednesdays, a circle called Anger Has a Voice. The children learned to name their storms without becoming them. Edmund asked how to help without breaking the spell. Miss Esther gave him jobs that dignified humility: sweeping before the doors opened, mending a wobbly shelf, brewing tea the way her aunt had taught her when kindness had to be warm enough to drink. The billionaire learned to set chairs quietly. He learned to wait. One afternoon, a father arrived angry at the world and at his own helplessness. "I brought my son because the school said I had to," he barked, white knuckles on a clipboard. Edmund lifted a hand toward the courtyard. "Walk with me," he said, no tie, pale hair unruly in the wind. Out among the brick and the tender green of the new tree, he said a sentence he had never practiced. "I was not gentle. I am learning." The father's shoulders sagged the way towers do in drawings when a child finally allows gravity. Miss Esther set boundaries as fiercely as she read. "No labels," she told the counselor who kept saying oppositional. "We describe behavior, not identity." She taped a paper to the door that read, "We do not measure children by how quiet they make adults feel." Another, "Crying is allowed. So is laughing. So is leaving and coming back." Alexander became a kind of map bearer for newcomers. He brought them to the shelf that had saved him. He showed them the chair that sat a little apart. He learned to ask, "Do you want company or space?" Sometimes he chose space. Two, and no one punished him for that choice. At the end of the first month, they held an evening circle for families. No speeches, no sponsors' plaques, just a ring of chairs under soft light. Brown hands and pale hands, small hands and vain ones. Miss Esther read a short poem about doors. Then she invited anyone, child or grown-up, to read a line from a book they loved or hated or didn't understand yet. Edmund cleared his throat. From a thin volume he had been carrying like contraband, he read 3 halting sentences about a boy who found a key in a wall and learned that locked was not the Same as forever. His voice cracked on key. He didn't apologize. Alexander slid his hand into his grandfather's. And for once the cameras did not click, because there were none. And because some moments are allergic to captions. Outside, the city kept time, with traffic lights and quarterly reports. Inside, the news center kept time with chapters and breath. The tree in the courtyard, thin, eager, stubborn, lifted its small leaves to the evening, as if practicing the posture of shade. They called it the listening room. But everyone knew what it really was. The place where a boy's rage learned to rest, where a billionaire learned to kneel without kneeling to anyone, and where a 72-year-old black librarian taught a city that stories do not fix children. They make room for children to fix themselves. The storm didn't arrive with thunder, it came with headlines. The first paper hit the newsstands on a gray Tuesday morning. Its front page, blood letters in red ink. Unlicensed librarian runs sect. For billionaire's grandson. The photograph showed Miss Esther mid-sentence, mouth open, eyes alight, her dark brown skin rendered almost menacing by the cruel contrast of the print. Alexander's small figure blurred beside her, and the caption beneath dripped insinuation, troubled. Air under influence. By noon, the story had metastasized across television panels, glossy blogs, and radio talk shows where hosts laughed loudly about storytime therapy. They called the listening room a cult of books, accused Edmund Carter of financing sentimental experiments, and suggested Miss Esther was preying on vulnerable children for power she hadn't earned. Inside the brick hall, the world remained gentler. The circle of chairs still welcomed, the bookshelf still breathed ink and promise, and the children still came. But the adults arrived tense now, eyes flicking toward the door, shoulders hunched as though bracing for impact. Miss Esther read. Anyway, she wore her patterned headscarf tied high, earrings small and firm against her skin, a cardigan patched where years had bitten. Her voice didn't falter, though she noticed the reporters crowding outside the window like wolves curious. About a lantern, Edmund Carter, pale as paper, leaned against the back wall that day. Jaw set so hard it seemed carved, his blue eyes cold in business rooms, merciless across negotiations, now burned with a helpless rage unfamiliar even to him. He had crushed competitors, bent senators, erased scandals with a check. But he could not stop words once the press had chosen their prey. The children noticed. Alexander, light-skinned and slight in his striped shirt, narrowed his eyes at the crowd outside. For the first time in weeks, his fist balled. He whispered, "They're calling her names." His voice trembled with both anger and loyalty. "They don't know," Miss Esther said softly, bending toward him. "We stay. That's how they learn." But staying wasn't simple anymore. Within a week, a letter arrived from the city council, notice of inquiry. Inspectors would visit, they said. Safety codes, educational oversight, child welfare standards, the words weren't neutral. They arrived already sharpened. The board of trustees, men in tailored suits, called Edmund to a meeting. In the conference room high above Manhattan, they spoke of liability, of image, of investors. "You've given her too much space," one said. "This is sentimental indulgence, not education. Shut it down before it stains the Carter legacy." Edmund's knuckles whitened against the polished table. "The Carter legacy," he answered, voice cold, "was built by breaking what could not be bought. This time, it will be built by protecting what cannot be priced." Still, doubt not. Miss Esther felt it in the children's questions. "Will they close us?" asked the girl who counted her breaths. "We have to leave the books here," asked the boy with fist. "No," Miss Esther said, quiet, steady. Yet at night, she sat in her small apartment with the drafty windows and let her shoulders sag. She remembered decades of telling stories to children who forgot her name. The moment they aged out of the library, this mattered differently. She had never been in the crosshairs before. One evening, as she left the center, a reporter thrust a microphone near her face. "Are you brainwashing the Carter heir?" The flash burst caught the furrows of her skin. She didn't answer. She simply kept walking, her small frame erect, the streetlights haloing her as though she carried her own weather. Alexander saw the clip on television. His chest clenched. For the first time, he wanted to defend someone else louder than he had ever defended himself. He stormed into his grandfather's study oak desk, framed oil paintings, glass that reflected power back at you. "You can't let them hurt her," he cried, eyes wet, fists shaking. Edmund, in his 70s, pale hand trembling over a glass of whiskey, looked at his grandson. For once, the boy's anger wasn't destruction, it was protection. And that, Edmund thought, was the proof the world would never print. The storm outside kept howling. Officials circled. Cameras prowled. The listening room's door creaked under the weight of scrutiny. But inside, Miss Esther kept her voice low, kept her story steady. as if the words themselves might be mortar against the siege. And somehow, in that fragile defiance, the room still held. The night was heavy with silence. Manhattan glittered outside the windows of the Carter penthouse, but inside, the air was thick, the kind that carried secrets too long withheld. Edmund Carter sat in his leather armchair, hands clasped so tightly the veins bulged against his pale skin. His blue eyes that had cowed boardrooms, that had bought senators, looked strangely unfocused, as if staring at something far behind the glass walls. His face, carved by 70 years of victories, now seemed like a battlefield scarred, not by rivals, but by his own regrets. Across from him, Alexander shifted uneasily. His weary frame curled into the corner of the couch. His light brown curls drooped into his eyes, his skin pale against the navy sweater he clutched. He expected scolding, another lecture about reputation, headlines, power. But his grandfather was uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, Edmund spoke. His voice, once sharp as broken glass, was softer, rougher, as though dragged across gravel. "When I was your age," he began, staring not at the boy but at the city below, "I broke things too. More than you. Chairs, doors, sometimes people's noses. They called me a problem. And I believed them." Alexander's eyes widened. He had never imagined his grandfather a man who commanded empires, with a glance being wild, uncontrolled. "No one ever gave me a story," Edmund continued, his jaw tightening. "No one sat with me in a quiet room. No one told me I was more than my anger. They just," he exhaled sharply, "they sent me away to schools, to camps, to silence. And I learned to build walls taller than my rage." He looked at Alexander, then really looked. The boy's face mirrored his own from decades past, the clenched fist, the restless tremor in the jaw, the fire that could burn or destroy depending on whether someone dared to guide it. "I was wrong with you," Edmund whispered. "I thought I could buy control, discipline, cures. I thought money was enough. But all I gave you was my own loneliness." Alexander swallowed hard. His throat hurt, as if words were trapped there, too frightened to come out. For a moment, silence pressed again. And then Edmund, cold, impenetrable Edmund, leaned forward, his hands trembling as they reached for his grandson's small fist. His pale skin against Alexander's lighter brown hands was a fragile bridge, but a bridge nonetheless. "I'm sorry, Alexander," he said. The words sounded foreign on his tongue, but true. "I don't want you to become me. Forgive me for not being the man you needed." Alexander's lip quivered. His anger, so quick, so sharp, dissolved into something he didn't recognize. His eyes blurred. He blinked hard, but the tears came anyway. Miss Esther stood quietly in the doorway. She didn't intrude, didn't lecture. She simply watched as the chasm of generations filled, not with wealth or power, but with 3 words Edmund Carter had never dared speak before. "I am sorry," for the first time. Alexander leaned into his grandfather instead of away. Their embrace was stiff, awkward, but real, the kind of contact that had the power to mend a boy and redeem an old man in the same breath. Outside, the city kept glittering, oblivious. But in that room, for the first time, the Carters were no longer chained by silence. The morning sun washed the library courtyard in soft gold. The building, old red brick, ivy creeping along its sides, had stood for decades as a quiet refuge in the middle of a restless city. Now, for the first time, its courtyard was filled with people, children clutching books, reporters with cameras slung across their shoulders, and parents lingering in cautious curiosity. At the center of it all stood Miss Esther. 72 years of life showed in the fine lines across her dark, warm skin, in the silver gray hair pulled neatly beneath a wide-brimmed hat, in the calm steadiness of her hands. But her presence was not frail, it was commanding, radiant. She wore her usual cardigan and long skirt, colors muted, as if she herself had decided that children's laughter should be the brightest part of the day. Beside her was Alexander, the grandson of Edmund Carter. The boy looked different now, still restless, still quick with energy, but his posture had softened. His hazel eyes, once hard with anger, now carried sparks of wonder, the kind that came from nights spent under the spell of stories. He stood close to Esther, dirt smudging his jeans, one hand gripping the handle of a small spade. And then there was Edmund Carter himself, towering over the crowd in a charcoal suit. His skin was pale, his white hair sharp against his tan. For years he had been photographed against skylines and marble offices, but today he looked strangely out of place, awkward, almost human. His eyes stayed fixed on the ground before him, as if this act of planning, so simple, carried more weight than all the contracts he had ever signed. Esther knelt, her knees pressing into the soil. The ground was already prepared, a neat hollow, waiting for life to take root. She glanced at Alexander, her voice warm, low enough to carry only to him. "Stories are like this, child," she said, pressing the young sapling into the earth. They start small, fragile. You don't shout them into growing. You don't punish them into shape. You tend them, water them, stay with them. Alexander's breath caught. He knelt beside her, his pale fingers brushing against her dark ones. As they pressed soil back into place around the roots, his hands trembled. Not from anger, but from something new. Care. Esther smiled. We grow too, Alexander. Just not all at once. And we never grow alone. The boy looked at her, lips parting as if to speak, but the words failed. Instead, he leaned against her shoulder for the briefest moment. Cameras clicked, reporters scribbled, but Esther didn't notice. The world could record what it wished this moment was theirs. Edmund stepped closer. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached for the watering can resting nearby. His strong, pale hands that once crushed deals and ended careers tilted the can, releasing a thin stream of water onto the soil. He cleared his throat, voice breaking against his own unfamiliar vulnerability. May it grow stronger than I did, he muttered. Gasps stirred among the onlookers. For the first time, Edmund Carter had spoken not as a magnet, but as a man. The crowd fell silent as Esther placed her palm on the boy's back, guiding his posture upright. The sapling, slender, green, fragile, stood between them, its roots now hidden but alive, its leaves trembling against the morning light. And though no one said it aloud, everyone felt it. This tree was not just a plant. It was forgiveness. It was second chances. It was proof that stories like children, like people, could flourish if only someone chose to stay. The seasons had shifted. What was once a fragile sapling now spread its young branches outward, brushing the windows of the library like gentle fingers against glass. The courtyard, once bare, had become alive, benches painted in bright colors, chalk drawings sprawling across the pavement, the smell of paper and soil mingling in the air. Children filled the space. Some sat cross-legged with books in their laps, lips moving silently as they traced the words with small fingers. Others clustered around Esther, waiting for her voice, her patient cadence, the way she made even the simplest tale shimmer with magic. Their laughter rose, a sound that wove itself into the brick walls and refused to leave. Esther sat at the center of it all, her skin glowing in the soft light, the silver threads of her hair catching the sun. She was older still, yes, but time had etched not weariness, but depth into her face. The cardigan she wore was slightly frayed at the sleeves, yet she wore it like a badge of honor, the uniform of someone who had chosen presence over prestige. Alexander was no longer the boy who stormed classrooms. His hazel eyes were calmer now, steadier, though still lit with curiosity and the occasional spark of mischief. He sat on the ground, his jeans dusty, colored pencils scattered around him, his tongue pressed lightly against his lip as he concentrated, sketching on a piece of thick paper. When at last he looked up, he rose, crossing the courtyard with the drawing pressed against his chest. He stopped before Esther, breathless but smiling. Miss Esther, he said softly, I made this for you. She unfolded the paper. The drawing was simple, childlike but powerful. Two figures stood hand in hand, one tall, her gray hair flowing like silver ribbons, her skin dark and warm, the other smaller, pale-skinned, with a smile that stretched wide across his face. Above them, a tree towered, its branches sprawling with green leaves, reaching for the sky. For a moment, Esther could not speak. Her eyes shimmered with tears, but she blinked them away, not to hide them, but to see more clearly. She touched the paper as if it were something sacred. It's us, Alexander whispered, and the tree. We're growing together. Behind them, Edmund Carter stood. The billionaire's suit was immaculate as always, but he looked softer now, less like a figure carved from marble and more like a man. His pale face held a quiet pride, not only in his grandson, but in the woman who had reshaped them both. For once, he did not need to command attention. It was enough to simply watch. Esther gathered Alexander into her arms, the boy leaning into her with trust. Around them, the children kept reading, their laughter rising again, refusing to be silenced. The tree rustled above them, its leaves swaying as if in agreement with the rhythm of the courtyard. The camera lingered on the drawing in Esther's hand, then slowly tilted upward, past the children, past the old red brick, past the library's roof, into the branches of the tree. The leaves filled the frame, green, vibrant, alive. Sunlight filtered through them, blinding for a moment, then soft. The screen faded, but the echo of laughter and the rustle of leaves lingered, as if the story itself had taken root.